It was a slow, rainy afternoon. The kind where the world feels muffled, as if the air itself is holding its breath. I lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, while the clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound almost too loud in the silence. I didn't usually nap during the day, but today felt different. It was my birthday, though I didn't feel particularly celebratory. There was no party, no grand gestures, just a quiet day the way I liked it. The room felt comfortable in its stillness. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, casting everything in a soft, muted glow. I hadn't even bothered to get out of bed yet. The sheets were cool against my skin, the pillow firm yet comfortable. I was just about to drift off again when I heard a soft knock at the door, barely audible over the hum of the rain. "Come in," I called, not really expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. It was as if she had stepped out of a distant memory and into my present. But then the shape of her, the way she carried herself, the familiar scent of her perfume. Suddenly, it all clicked. Emma. She was my neighbor. She had always been around in some way since we were kids. Just a couple of years younger than me, we had spent countless hours together, running through the neighborhood, getting into trouble, talking about everything and nothing. But over the years we drifted apart. Not because of anything bad, but simply because life tends to do that. Time changes things. People move on, start their own lives. Yet Emma had always been there, lingering at the edges of my life. Every now and then, we'd run into each other at the grocery store, or I'd catch a glimpse of her walking her dog past my house. She still lived in the same little cottage next door, just like she always had. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth I wasn't expecting. It sounded like it had been a long time since we'd spoken, even though it had only been a few months. "Hey, Emma," I replied, my voice rough from sleep. "What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment, standing by the door. There was a quiet tension in the air, something unspoken, though I couldn't tell what. Maybe she hadn't expected to find me like this, lying in bed in an old t-shirt and a pair of jeans I had long stopped caring about. She glanced down at her feet, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. But then, with a small, almost shy smile, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I brought you something," she said, her voice a little nervous. She held a small package wrapped in simple brown paper, tied up with twine. It wasn't big, but I could tell by the way she cradled it that it meant something to her. I sat up in bed, suddenly more awake, curiosity and confusion bubbling up inside me. "You didn't have to get me anything," I said, trying to sound casual. "You've already given me more than enough over the years." She raised an eyebrow, as if that wasn't quite what she had meant. Her lips curved into that familiar smirk I remembered from childhood, like she was about to laugh at something only she understood. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I wanted to. It's something special." She stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bed, her knees brushing against the blanket. The room felt smaller now, more intimate. I had always thought of Emma as just a neighbor or friend, but now, sitting this close, I noticed things I hadn't before. The way her hair fell a little too perfectly around her shoulders, the way she tucked a stray lock behind her ear when she was nervous, the softness in her eyes that I had never really seen before. Something had shifted, something I wasn't prepared for. I looked down at the little bundle in her hands. "What is it?" I asked, trying to push aside the strange feeling creeping up my spine. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gave me a look, one that was equal parts teasing and uncertain. There was something flickering in her eyes, a depth of vulnerability. And in that moment I realized, whatever was inside that package, it wasn't just a gift. It was something more. I hadn't noticed before. "Open it," she said simply. I took the package from her, running my fingers over the rough paper. It was a delicate thing, small but meaningful. As I untied the twine and peeled back the paper, I found a small wooden box inside. It was plain, nothing fancy, but there was something about it that felt personal. Slowly I opened it. Inside was a simple necklace, a small pendant shaped like a star, its surface etched with tiny, intricate designs. It was beautiful in its simplicity. My fingers brushed over it, feeling the cool weight of the metal, but there was something heavier about it. Something beyond just the material. It's beautiful, I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. I wasn't sure if I was talking about the necklace or the gesture itself. She smiled, her eyes softening. I thought you might like it. I remember you always said you wanted one when we were kids. I was surprised she remembered. We hadn't talked about things like that in years. And yet, here she was, bringing up some long-forgotten childhood wish. It felt like something deep, like a bridge between our past and whatever this moment was now. I didn't know how to say what I was feeling, so I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I placed the necklace on the nightstand and turned to face her fully. My heart was racing now, though I didn't quite understand why. Maybe it was the surprise of it all. Or maybe it was something more. Thank you. I finally managed, my voice low. She reached out then, her hand hovering near my face, before gently brushing a strand of hair away from my forehead. Her touch was soft, but it lingered. Something in me tightened at the simple gesture. And then, without another word, she leaned in. Her lips brushed against my cheek, soft and brief, but it felt like everything stopped for just a moment. The world outside, the rain tapping against the windows, the clock ticking steadily on the wall. It all faded, leaving only the warmth of her kiss and the unexpectedness of it all. When she pulled back, her eyes stayed locked on mine. For a second, neither of us moved. "Happy birthday," she whispered. And in her voice, there was something unspoken, something that hung between us waiting. That was when I realized I hadn't known what gift she had for me. But this was more than I could have ever expected. The room was still warm, the air thick with the quiet that followed her kiss. I hadn't expected it. I hadn't even known it was something I had been longing for until that very moment. It wasn't just about the kiss itself, though that had been unexpected and gentle. It was the connection, the unspoken thing that flared to life between us like a spark catching dry wood. She didn't move right away. Neither of us did. For a long time, we just sat there, both a little uncertain, but somehow, neither of us wanted to break the silence. Emma had always been different from everyone else. I couldn't put it into words, but there was something grounded about her, something steady. When we were younger, I had always felt her presence in a way that made it seem like she was a constant, a part of the fabric of my world. Like the sunlight in the morning, reliable but never overwhelming. But now, sitting next to me on the edge of the bed, everything about her felt different. Or maybe, everything between us had always been this way, and I was only just now seeing it. I wondered if she felt it too, that strange current between us. It wasn't just the kiss. It was something deeper, something that had been there for a long time. Probably since we were both too young to understand what it meant. She hesitated, glancing at the necklace I had left on the nightstand, almost as if deciding whether to comment on it. But instead, she turned back to me, her lips curling into that familiar, amused smile. "You look surprised," she said, her voice light, though there was something more serious beneath it. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake off the dazed feeling settling over me. "I am surprised. But not in a bad way." She chuckled softly, her eyes softening. "Good. I didn't want it to be weird or make you uncomfortable." We sat there for a few moments, the air between us holding something unspoken, until I finally asked, "Why did you do it?" "The kiss, I mean." Her eyes flickered, and I could tell she was thinking carefully about how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quiet. I think I've wanted to do it for a while. Maybe longer than I even realized." She looked down, fiddling with the sleeve of her sweater, the same one I'd seen her wear last week when she walked her dog past my house. A surge of something swelled inside me. Could it really be that simple? Or was there more to it? The possibility of more was a thought I hadn't allowed myself to entertain until now. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I think I understand more than you know." There was a beat of silence before she looked at me again, her gaze more intense than before. She studied me for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind, deciding whether or not to push further. Then she let out a slow breath and smiled. That quiet smile. The one that always seemed to hold more than it revealed. "Maybe," she said slowly, "there's always been something between us. We were close when we were younger, but I think I think we both grew up with certain ideas about what that meant. She paused, searching my face. But now, maybe it's different. The words lingered in the room like a question. An invitation, maybe. And I couldn't help but think she was right. Something had shifted. But what was it? And where were we going from here? I wasn't sure what this meant, what we were stepping into, but I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want this moment to end. Not yet. Not when the air between us felt so charged, so alive. There was something raw, something unrefined about the way I felt in her presence. A vulnerability that hadn't been there before. And Emma, she wasn't running from it. She was here, sitting with me, just as uncertain, just as open to whatever might come next. I swallowed, trying to gather my thoughts. You know, I said after a while, my voice quieter now. I always wondered what it would be like. She tilted her head slightly, listening. Not just the kiss, I continued, but us. Now, after all these years. Her eyes softened, the corners of her mouth lifting in a gentle, knowing smile. It's funny, she said. I've wondered the same thing. It was like a veil had been lifted between us. Something that had been there all along, but only now felt fully visible. I looked at her again. Really looked at her. For the first time, I noticed how much time had passed since we were kids. The way she had grown into herself, the subtle changes in her features, the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She was a woman now, and though that truth had always been there, suddenly, it seemed so very clear. For a moment, I thought I might say something more. Something about the past, the future, about where we were headed. But the words didn't come. Instead, I did something far simpler. I reached out and took her hand in mine. Gently, almost cautiously, like a bridge being built between two people who hadn't realized how far apart they had drifted, until now. Her fingers closed around mine, warm and steady. You've always been there, I said, almost more to myself than to her. Even when we didn't talk. Even when I wasn't sure what we were. You've always been a part of my life. Emma didn't answer right away, but the way she squeezed my hand was answer enough. She understood. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been buried for a long time, shifted. I didn't know what it meant yet, this new closeness, this unspoken connection. But I knew it was something I'd have to reckon with. For both of us. Her eyes stayed steady on mine as we sat there in the quiet room. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. A sense of rightness, despite the uncertainty swirling in the air. Maybe we don't need to know what it all means right now, she said softly, her voice a little more confident now. Maybe we can just let it be. I nodded. I wasn't sure if I agreed with every word, but I felt the truth in them nonetheless. There was still so much to explore, so much to discover. But for now, I didn't need all the answers. I just needed her here beside me. And maybe for today that was enough. The days that followed Emma's unexpected visit felt different. Though at the time, I couldn't quite pinpoint why. The house still creaked with the same familiar sounds. The floorboards groaning under my feet. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But something between us had shifted. The tension was palpable, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was more like a quiet understanding. Something unspoken. Something neither of us fully acknowledged, but both of us felt deeply. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way her laugh lingered in my memory longer than it should. The way the scent of her perfume seemed to hang in the air long after she'd left. How even the smallest interactions between us felt different. Whether we bumped into each other at the grocery store, or exchanged pleasantries while tending to our respective yards, there was an undercurrent of something more. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that came after it. The softening of boundaries. The reawakening of something that had been dormant between us for years. At first, we didn't speak about that moment again. Neither of us seemed ready for it. But it hung there, lingering in the spaces we shared. It was the elephant in the room. The unspoken truth neither of us was willing to name. But even in silence we communicated. The way Emma's eyes softened when they met mine. The way she lingered a little longer than usual whenever we talked. Those quiet gestures spoke volumes. And I found myself falling into them. Letting them fill the gaps between the words we didn't say. I found myself thinking about her more than I had in years. Wondering what she was doing. Where she was going. what thoughts occupied her mind. And sometimes, just sometimes, I caught myself imagining what it might be like. Us. Together. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Like a leap into unknown waters. It was on a Thursday afternoon, almost a week after her visit, that I saw her again. This time it wasn't at the store. Or by the fence. There was something different about her this time. Unannounced, an openness, a vulnerability. That told me this wasn't a casual visit. I opened the door. A slight wave of surprise rushing over me as I took her in. She stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her hair windswept from the walk. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, but carrying that familiar warmth. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I couldn't help but notice how she looked, fresh and yet older. Wiser. There was an ease to her now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "I was hoping we could talk," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "About last week." I nodded slowly, stepping aside to let her in. I hadn't expected her to bring it up again, but now that she had, I realized, I was relieved. The uncertainty between us had been lingering, stretching out in every unspoken glance, every hesitant moment. I had been waiting for this, waiting for the moment when we would finally confront it. Emma stepped inside, her boots making soft thuds against the wooden floor. I closed the door behind her, and for a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. "Do you want something to drink?" I asked. It felt like a pointless question in the face of everything left unsaid, but I needed something, anything, to bridge the silence. "No, I'm okay," she replied, her gaze steady. I've been thinking about what happened, and I think I owe it to us to say what's on my mind." I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words. She was treading lightly, just as I had been. Both of us trying to find our way through the delicate space we had stumbled into. "I don't know what it means," she admitted. "What we're doing. Where we're going with this." Her voice was vulnerable, but also stronger than I had expected. "But I do know that I don't want to ignore it. I don't want to pretend like things haven't changed between us." I swallowed, her words sinking into me, heavy and undeniable. I felt it too. The same uncertainty, the same stirring desire to acknowledge what was happening between us without fully understanding it. "Neither do I," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt different, and I didn't know how to explain it. But I didn't want it to go away. Her eyes softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I don't want it to go away either," she admitted. "But I also don't want to rush into anything. I want us to figure this out. Slowly. To understand what this is before we do anything we might regret." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into me. The urgency I had once felt, the need to define this, to put a name to it, was fading. Maybe we didn't have to rush. Maybe some things weren't meant to be forced into shape. Maybe they just became. She stepped closer then, just enough to close the space between us, but not enough to feel overwhelming. It was as though we were both giving each other room to breathe, to be sure. "I'm not asking for anything," she said softly, like she was sharing a secret. "I just don't want to lose whatever this is. I don't want to let it slip away, because we're too afraid to admit it." My heart tightened at her words, a rush of emotion flooding through me. I had been afraid. Afraid of what might happen if we crossed that line. Afraid of what it would mean if we gave in to whatever this was between us. But hearing her say it out loud, acknowledging both the fear and the possibility, made it feel less daunting. More like something we could walk through. Together. "I don't want to lose it either," I said finally, letting my guard down. "But I don't want to rush. We can take our time. Figure this out. Whatever this is." She smiled then. That smile that always had a way of making everything feel more possible. And when she reached out, her fingers resting gently over mine, I felt something settle inside me. Calm. For the first time in years. It felt like we weren't just dancing around something unspoken. We were acknowledging it. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "I think we're both ready." And just like that, the tension that had been hanging between us, that fragile uncertainty, eased. It wasn't gone, not entirely. But it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a path. One we were both willing to walk. Side by side. At our own pace. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know where this would lead, but in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. We were no longer two people caught in the past, unsure of what had changed. We were two people standing together, ready to face whatever came next. And maybe for now that was enough.